Hello everyone, this is Menalesh Meti in English. I have Assistant Professor Beniam Awash today. I had Professor Beniam last time. We talked about a lot about Horn of Africa and the United States foreign policy and the rest of it. And today we will be talking about the election, the US election, and the impact in Africa, Horn of Africa, or diaspora politics in Ethiopia. Stay with us. Hello, Assistant Professor Beniam. Thank you so much for coming again. Last time we had a really long talk and discussion about Horn of Africa and politics in that area and the USA foreign policy. But today I really wanted to invite you because I wanted to hear about your views about the results of United States results of the 2024 election. It took many people by surprise, the result. The Republicans are here now in power, the Democrats are gone, and there has been a lot of talk about it in terms of what America is going to be like with Trump's government and what the diaspora's is going to be in America, because there's a lot of talks about deportation and other stuff. And what is Trump's view about foreign policy of the United States? So first of all, did it take you by surprise? What did you think of the result? Did you expect it to be like that?
So again, a pleasure to be with you. I wouldn't say that it took me by surprise. Actually, it could have gone either way. And if you're really analyzing the US elections and you're a serious observer of the US elections, there should be warning signs throughout the campaign period that it could be going towards a Republican, both in terms of the presidency as well as the other Senate and House. So just to keep in mind the results of the election. Trump is now the incumbent. He's going to be the president, so he won the presidency. Republicans, with the Trump effect, you can say, have won the Senate. They've won the House. Trump himself, remarkably, has won the popular vote. That has not happened for a Republican candidate for quite some time, several decades, in fact. He also won in terms of the highest percentages of Hispanic votes since 1970s. Trump also won the working class vote, and he increased his support amongst every single demographics, with the exception of those that are rich and wealthy. So that means about $150,000 and more in terms of income. So when you see that, it begs the question, how is it possible that serious analysts were unable to see the electorate's, let's say, preferences and the way in which they were going to vote? So that's one thing that we can think about. And so, when I look at that and reflect, how is it possible that you have such a resounding defeat for the Democrats? Any resounding, it almost looks like a mandate, if you will, right, for the Trump 2 administration. And we have to look at that maybe in two ways. One is a little bit longer historical trajectory. And the first reason you can think about in terms of the American electorate is, how are they living? What are their economic circumstances like? And that essentially is terrible, right? So the process that you have, one of the campaign talking points for the Trump campaign was bringing back the jobs, right? And bringing back the jobs to the United States, manufacturing jobs specifically, because the US was deindustrialized. This process of deindustrialization actually starts in the 1970s and 80s, and you have over 31 million jobs that were lost. Right? In the late 1990s to about 2001, 2002, you have 5 million manufacturing jobs that are being lost. These, by the way, are also hitting some of the key swing states. These swing states such as Michigan, the Rust Belt, or the essentially the manufacturing belt that used to be a manufacturing belt. They all went in terms of voting for Trump, right? Because again, he's speaking to these economic issues. So one is the process of deindustrialization that both parties, by the way, were unanimous about and oversaw. The second thing also that explains the condition of the American electorate is the fact that wages have been stagnating. So generally, wages follow productivity. Starting World War II in the United States, wages of average Americans that are working in terms of their salary is increasing following productivity. So wages increased by 91% and productivity was about 97%. Starting from the 1970s, while you're having the deindustrialization of the United States and the shutting down of factories and the loss of manufacturing jobs, wages themselves are stuck. So productivity of American workers is still increasing, right? It's about 70, 80, actually 91%, while the wage increase is 9%. So you can ask, where's the productivity gains going? Essentially to shareholders. So this is the context in which you can think in terms of the long term. But now let's look at the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party in a two-party system is supposed to represent the working class. And what they've done over a long period of time is actually to betray and abandon that working class. And you can see this because people that normally were voting Republican during the Obama presidency voted for Obama in places like Milwaukee, in places like Michigan, right? Again, industrial swing states. But they switched again with a disappointment in Obama and voted for Trump during his first bid to become president. And then they vote again for Biden with the hopes again that each administration can come and resolve the key issues that are affecting them. So this is one of the ways you can think about that. And a second sort of element in terms of the Democratic Party is very remarkably, the Democratic Party essentially is the party of war in the United States. It's filled with the most hawkish. It's filled with the sort of intelligence apparatus that are really promoters within the Democratic Party of war. War in terms of Ukraine and pushing more war, funding more war. So in the United States, as people are suffering in terms of the economic outlook, right? A huge inflation in this country. What they see is a Democratic administration under Biden that is sending billions of dollars to overseas wars. And that didn't sit well with the electorate. Another thing I think which is very important and shouldn't be dismissed is the Democratic Party has legitimized and facilitated an ongoing genocide. Professor Amos Goldberg, who's a professor of genocide studies at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, very recently I was reading a tweet from him, says, yes, it is a genocide. It's so difficult and painful to admit it, but we can no longer avoid the conclusion. Right? This is a quote. And so the Democratic Party is again tarnished with this, right? We've had almost an entire year of live streamed watching an ongoing ethnic cleansing and genocide. And so this also played very importantly with certain demographics within the United States in terms of the electorate. And if you think about it, the Democratic Party has had many opportunities to reflect upon and think how they can become relevant as a political party. But yet, after the election, in terms of the results, what you have is Democratic talking points, so talking heads, Democratic sort of activists that are engaging in name calling and blaming the loss of the election on the conduct of, let's say, Black men, right? So Black men somehow are averse to voting for a woman, Kamala Harris, which is absolutely preposterous. And so there's a process of blaming, maybe even focusing on fear mongering, but not necessarily a reflection of their own actions, right? And so that's an important element. And last but not least, ask somebody randomly who is even a Kamala Harris supporter, what does she stand for? What is her political platform in terms of actually what she's going to bring to the table for the American electorate? Many of them are going to give you a blank stare. And the reason why is because she had nothing. It was an empty shell. And the only thing that was going in terms of the Kamala Harris campaign was showing and stoking fear, that fear of Trump and the discourse that was very divisive that was coming from the Trump campaign. That is not a positive politics that can galvanize people to come out to vote for her and for the Democrats. So again, a remarkably weak candidate. And last but not least, again, without leaving Kamala Harris was not democratically selected. In fact, the Democratic Party went again its own democratic process of having a primary in which various contenders can provide the Democratic primary participants with an opportunity, right? That's issue based. None of that was there. She was selected. She was selected. So we have a president, Joe Biden, who is missing in action. And then we have a vice president who's practically missing in action in terms of policy or any viable even relationship to Democratic Party members and those that self-identify as Democrats. So it became a very powerful, $1 billion+ marketing campaign to convince people to vote for a candidate that had nothing to offer and was simply the anti-Trump candidate. And as you see, this is the consequence.
Well, normally people will come, whoever's coming to power, they will say all sort of things, I'll do this and that. And then, of course, when they come to power, there's a chance of them not doing all that stuff. But Trump saying, we'll change the economy, bringing about more jobs and things. Do you really think people actually really trust Trump? Or, previously when President Joe Biden was there and the chance of the Democrats was really, really low. And then when Kamala Harris came and there was that, energy in the air, people would have gone for Democrats. And then suddenly it was so unpredictable. And that it turns out to be, especially more of the diaspora community, seem to be fond of the Republicans. Maybe I wanted to talk about how the diaspora community reacted to bring the Republicans to power.
Very good. Western democracy is highly flawed. So you have one election after another, but the underlying social and economic situation of people is not addressed and doesn't change. And it is because of that reason that you have a level of both divisiveness, but also a willingness to look at candidates that otherwise seem extremely ridiculous. And you see that over and over, even in Europe as well, right? Much more right-wing candidates that are presenting themselves as populist. And it's because the formal structures, so-called democratic structures, are not democratic in nature. They're not reflecting the wills of the people. And that becomes then a kind of a gridlock, a system that doesn't work. So in many ways, that's what it's reflecting. So the fact that you have a candidate that promises something, but then once they come into office do not deliver, that's actually expected, right? So it's not necessarily an expectation that Trump administration is coming in to actually solve the economic issues. And we can talk a little about that. How are they aiming to do something really realistic? But in this election, what's very also interesting is the participation of diaspora groups and African diaspora groups as well. African diaspora groups, some of the largest ones, such Nigerian, for instance, Nigerian American diaspora groups, very much were for Kamala Harris for various reasons. The Ethiopian American diaspora group, again, it's not monolithic, but nevertheless were hedging their bets. They had a very kind of sour experience with the Biden administration as it pertains to the Horn of Africa. There was a brutal war, 2-year war. The U.S. administration was seen as extremely biased and interventionist in terms of Ethiopia. It did not play a positive role in terms of bringing peace. It gave a blank check also to the newly enshrined government, the Prosperity Party, which itself was very problematic, right? It's a blank check in return for opening up the Ethiopian economy. So there was some already history, bad blood, let's say, in terms of the track record of the Biden administration. But I look at particularly the Ethiopian diaspora communities sort of organized attempt to influence the election as a way of setting an agenda and being able to also provide incoming administration, both Democratic and Republican, a set of information regarding the conditions of Ethiopia and the kind of the importance of promoting peace, stopping war, promoting human rights, particularly as it pertains to Oromia and Amara right now. Amara regions, the two largest states in Ethiopia, and so the Ethiopian diaspora community is interesting in the sense that they also I call it the Kanye effect, Kanye West effect. If you remember the hip hop artist Kanye West, he made waves first time when he came out and actually said he would support Trump. And in fact, he was saying, why should I be taken for granted? Why should my vote be taken for granted? Because the Democratic Party essentially takes particularly Black Americans, African Americans, and the African diaspora, take them for granted without giving anything in return, expected to simply show up and vote. And so the demonstration effect, I think, is important. It's not that the Ethiopian diaspora, let's say, electorate is large enough or even strategic enough in swing states, for instance, to swing an election this way or that way. But nevertheless, the demonstration effect was I think, very significant and important, that you cannot be taken for granted, and that it should be issue-based, not identity-based. And so the issues are what matter. And so the issues of the community around, for instance, the removal of sanctions on Ethiopia, around the promotion of human rights, etc., are central. And so that's the message, I think, that was being sent, and it was very interesting.
There is more. If we talk about the very popular artists, they came out to support Kamala Harris and all the female Beyonce and then the rest of them. There's all nearly very popular ones came out to support her. Yes. But then, in terms of Ethiopian diaspora, I would say Habeshan diaspora, including Eritrea, rather than knowing the future, I think it's very unpredictable what's coming in the future. But everybody knows what happened in the past during the Biden administration, Obama even previously. So everybody were very disappointed, angry, and they wanted to give a statement out loud that we do not want Democrats to be in power. Do you think that's really kind of a revenge, what the statement was, rather than really ideology or anything else?
So I think ideologically, the community is not monolithic. So you have some that tend to be conservative. They can be culturally and socially conservative. Others that are liberal. You have politically groups that are very conservative in terms of what they want in terms of taxes, how they want the economy to be organized. And so you have those differences. But like you said,
there's also religious aspects in it. Sorry, I forgot.
Absolutely. So I don't think it's necessarily tied to sort of a particular ideology, but like you said, it's this track record, right, that galvanized that community kind of to act in that way. Now, one of the things to ask is, in terms of U.S. foreign policy, how is U.S. foreign policy of the government's behavior changed? And the ethnic-based diaspora groups that are galvanized around mobilizing with an electoral sort of process to try to change the government's behavior, in many cases, it depends on the existing policy of the U.S. So if you remember, the Ethiopian and generally Habesha community, you could say, were very much mobilized for years during the 1993 until 2018 period. And the US government did inch because there was a divergence. U.S. interest in Ethiopia was tied to the existing EPRDF government. They had security interest, etc. And so the demands from the diaspora community at that time for more accountability, for more democracy, human rights, etc., had no practical impact because there was a divergence of interest. You can look at the Cuban, for instance, community, of which, by the way, the new nominee for Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, comes from in Florida. And the Cuban community in Florida has been very much vocal, well organized in order to try to have a regime change essentially in Cuba. And they've been very much welcomed and supported, and they work in almost harmony with US policymakers. Why? Because there's a convergence of interest. And I think that's a very important sort of framework to think about in terms of how is it that diaspora groups can actually have a certain type of impact in terms of US foreign policy. And so let's wait and see what the interests are in terms of the Trump administration and the way, for instance, some of these groups can actually help to shape that policy.
What do you think? What do you think the future holds for Ethiopia or Horn of Africa during Trump's government? Do you think there will be any change?
Well, if you remember, Trump already had one period, right, in terms of having an administration, and during that period, there were certain characteristics of the Trump administration. One of which, for instance, was an absolute sort of disinterest for Africa in his administration, and that disinterest, by the way, was manifesting itself in, let's say, two forms. One was no single presidential visit during the Trump administration years to Africa, right? But interestingly, Biden also, so from about 2017 to 2021, no single US presidential visit to any African country. Biden, 2021 to 2025 now, no single, so almost a decade, no single US president has visited Africa. So that says something also, not just about Trump, but also about US foreign policy, that it did not find Africa to be relevant and of priority in order to have presidential visits. Compare that, for instance, to China, right? So Xi Jinping from 2014 to 2020 visited 10 times. Right? And his foreign minister, Wang Yi, during that time, who's state minister now, visited 48 African countries. So that what that already shows you is the degree of importance that Africa has for each of these, let's say, great powers, the US and China. It's important because in many ways, the US sees its Africa policy through its competition with China. It also sees the Africa policy through a counterterrorism lens. It sees the Africa policy through its desire to secure critical mineral resources. And so, in a way, even from the perspective of competition with its rival China and its influence in terms of Africa, you can see that it's a very kind of self-defeating strategy from that regard. The other thing you can see during the Trump administration was there's a huge decrease in bilateral trade between the U.S. and Africa in comparison to Africa's trade with other regions. You can also see a significant amount of delinking from very key international organizations. If you remember, there was an attempt for the U.S. to withdraw from the World Health Organization. The first Trump administration withdrew the U.S. from the Paris Climate Accords, which were very critical from the African perspective, because Africa is the most impacted and the first impacted by the negative effects of climate change. And so you can see there was a disregard for essentially international law and global level cooperation during the first Trump administration. Last but not least, let's not forget, Trump also was extremely disrespectful and derogatory to African states and people. So that's the first sort of iteration in terms of Trump. I think what's very important is to see kind of how Biden, slight change. So Biden created a strategy during the Biden administration, August 2022. It's a U.S. strategy for sub-Saharan Africa. And the pillars of the U.S. strategy actually focuses on four things. If I can just let you know very quickly. One is fostering open societies. Second is delivering democratic and security dividends. So I ask you and your audience, think about what does fostering open societies mean, right? It's just a talking point. Now, we have incredible levels of actually decreasing open societies and censorship in the West, right? So the irony can't, go without being commented upon. Delivering democracy, I just told you, we have a zombie democracy in the United States that is really in trouble. Okay, so what we're left with then is security, advancing economic opportunities, and supporting climate adaptation. So we now have the Trump administration that's coming in is essentially filled with climate deniers. They do not believe in climate change. They're not going to act as a very responsible actor in terms of climate adaptation, climate mitigation actions on a global level. So you can throw that away. The other aspect is economic opportunities. Economic opportunities is really in terms of investments, right? And what Africa needs is investments in infrastructure, as an example. Right now, China has over 30 large major infrastructural projects all over the African continent. The US is missing in action, right? And so during the Trump administration, we should expect neglect towards Africa. We should expect a decrease in terms of any meaningful type of sort of promotion of investment, particularly as it pertains to, let's say, infrastructural projects, et cetera. And so that's generally for, let's say, for Africa. In terms of the Horn of Africa, I think it becomes very interesting. So let's take Sudan, for instance. It's likely that the Trump administration may choose a winner between the two conflicting parties, the military and the militias, the rapid support forces. And so that's a possibility. But if you remember during the first Trump administration, the Trump administration viewed Sudan in relationship to the Middle East, particularly the Abraham Accords, the way in which the Trump administration was trying to bring Arab states to normalize their relationships with Israel. Of course, without dealing with the issue of Palestine and a Palestinian state under the rubric of a two-state solution. So this was really going around it. And the first two states to recognize were actually Bahrain and United Arab Emirates. And the third one was Sudan. And Sudan, very interestingly, was under sanctions, if you remember. It was also on state terror list for supporting this or that. And this goes back to the early 1990s. And so one of the inducements from the Trump administration was that the Sudan would be removed from the state terror list, and they would also have their sanctions unblocked. It was blocked in Congress by Senator Chuck Schumer from New York and ex-Senator Bob Mendez, the disgraced senator who's now on trial for corruption from New Jersey. And so the Trump administration actually sent Mike Pompeo at that time, and they made a deal. And the deal was, we'll remove you, we'll allow Sudan to actually access international credit, stabilize the society. Sudan at that time was also suffering from famine. In return, recognize Israel. Right, so it's a very transactional in nature, and that's one way we can think of in terms of its approach to Sudan. Somaliland, so the part of Somalia in the northeast, for those that do not know, which actually was a de facto sort of independent state, but not recognized when Somalia fractured, just had an election. And during the Trump first administration, some of the very key, actually very experienced officials that were staffing the Africa portfolio, one of which was Tibor Nagy, the veteran ambassador Tibor Nagy, who was Assistant Secretary for African Affairs. He mentioned, for instance, that during the Trump first administration, they were keen on recognizing Somaliland as a sovereign state. Somaliland has been looking, in terms of at least some political factions within Somaliland, have been looking for international recognition for them to become a state. And that's very important because they do not access international aid, they can't access international finance, etc. And so in the second Trump administration, I see a possibility that actually the US may recognize Somaliland as an independent state. This again brings it into conflict with the key documents when it comes to the African Union. It becomes exactly so. There's huge implications in terms of this. But remember, the U.S. also, over the long period in the Horn of Africa, has played a very critical role, and not in a positive way, by the way, but a critical role in breaking and making new states. The state of South Sudan is partly a result of U.S. policy in Sudan, right?
And the British, maybe.
Excuse
That's,
me?
and the British seem to be heavily involved in that as well.
Yes, of course. I mean, wherever the U.S. are, the British are going to have some work.
Yeah.
So yes, so that's one aspect. I think another thing which is kind of very interesting as well is the interest of Egypt as it pertains to the Horn of Africa, right?
Yeah,
And
I was gonna go say it there because Trump is one thing. Trump may say he's not interested in other countries' politics or internal affairs. He might just dismiss anything. I'm not interested in other countries. I'm only interested in the US. He might say that because he said it a few times. But then sometimes he interferes to saying, I remember him saying last time when he was in power, that Egypt should bomb, the dam. What do you think that's going to happen now about the dam and Trump's relationship with Egypt?
so even if you replace Trump with Kamala or you replace Kamala with Obama, it doesn't matter. US policy as it pertains to Egypt is rock solid. Egypt is critical for US national interest. It's critical because of its role in terms of the Middle East with vis-a-vis, for instance, Israel. And so Egypt's interests are always going to trump, so to speak, the interest of Ethiopia. So when it comes to the Nile water issue, which is there's a very powerful new legal document, the CFA, Comprehensive Framework Agreement, which is a Nile Basin agreement that gets rid of colonial era agreements that excluded all the upriver Nile Basin states, and which gave essentially a monopoly of all Nile waters to Egypt and Sudan. And so now this new document is actually very important because it has the signing and the acceptance of a majority of Nile riparian states. Ethiopia is at the focal point, a decade plus long period of trying to bring this new legal document that allows all states, again, all states, including Egypt and Sudan, to equitably use and share the Nile waters without hurting each other, and to think about sustainable development and to also promote regional integration. So it's a very important document. And so if you think of Egypt's position, so Egypt's position is not just vis-a-vis, let's say, Ethiopia's interests with respect to the Nile waters within its territorial boundaries, but Egypt's stance actually is putting on a damper with respect to the possibility of regional integration, regional cooperation, and moving forward along those lines. So the Trump administration's and just generally the US position to support Egypt actually has a regional ramification, not just only for Ethiopia as well. The other thing which I find very interesting, I think, is the developments in Somalia. Right, Somalia right now is actually working very, very hard, and that's the federal administration in Mogadishu. They lose close to $500 million, $500 million every single year to illegal fishing, and so they're working very hard, specifically with Turkey, to train a navy. They also working very hard in terms of developing relationships with external players such as the UAE, which is at sometimes friend, at other times a very problematic country that intervenes in the affairs of Somalia. But nevertheless, they're trying to create a federated country. So that's one aspect. So already the Trump administration's policy threatens Somalia's attempt to create a unified state where they can reconcile Jubaland, Puntland, Somaliland, etc., and where the security also requirements of all Somali territories can also be guaranteed through a very strong Somali state. So we don't see any movement towards that. In fact, during the first Trump administration, there was an attempt to de-link, to move any type of troops, etc., from Somalia, right? U.S. troops from Somalia. So when we think about security, not just only in terms of Al-Shabaab, but security from commercial enterprises that are essentially stealing from Somali territorial waters, there was no support and help during the first Trump administration. And so we shouldn't expect that during this time as well. With respect to Ethiopia and Eritrea, they're both under sanctions. Eritrea is under sanctions because it is essentially independent, right? This is one of the smallest states, even in terms of population, but it is independent. It acts upon its own national interest, and it has now worked particularly to develop relationships with Russia and China, and that itself puts it under the crosshairs. I think when you look at the competition between the US and its influence in Africa, it's really looking at through the lens of Russian presence, Chinese presence, and relationships. And so the sanctions on Eritrea are not going to be lifted, it seems. There are sanctions on Ethiopia that remain. In fact, they were renewed by the Biden administration in September 2024 for one more year. So even if Trump wanted perhaps to, and which he won't, they're still going to be on force in one year. There's the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which is a free trade agreement, preferential trade agreement actually, with that allows Ethiopia to garner about $100 million, and it was part of the strategy of pro-poor growth to industrialize Ethiopia based on textile production. So that sanctions during the war has continued. And so it's still punishing the country. The other thing I would say with respect to Ethiopia, which is very important, is that it is now essentially giving the keys to the US Treasury Department, IMF, and World Bank for Ethiopia's economy. It's a very unfortunate situation, but it's one thing to be politically independent, which Ethiopia is, but another thing to be economically not independent. And so the economic policies and the economy of Ethiopia is being shaped essentially by Washington. And unfortunately, that is going to create a significant amount of pain in Ethiopia.
Well, we've only got about 3 more minutes left, but I wanted to hear your view about Trump's government and the rest of the world. As you know, America behaves as the caretaker of the world, the most powerful nation economically, in terms of military, and the rest of it. There's war, Russia, Ukraine, Palestine, Israel, and lots of other wars everywhere. And America somehow seemed to get involved with many of it. And do you think the world is going to be different with Trump in terms of all these wars and whatever's happening in terms of borders and all the rest of it?
So it's a very interesting question. And I think many of us are actually kind of assessing that. And one way to assess actually is the team that he's compiling. Because again, he hasn't actually produced any policies yet. He's not in office, but nevertheless, the team that he's bringing together. So not surprisingly, some of his very important supporters, campaign donors, are getting their rewards. So with respect to, for instance, the war that's going on in the Middle East, we should expect a significant support for Israel, but specifically for the settler project. In fact, the most right-wing factions in Israeli society are asking to annex the West Bank, perhaps annex the Golan and even parts of Lebanon, and there's expectation to annex Gaza, etc. So there's perhaps a willingness in that regard. There is not a willingness to go to war with Iran, despite the fact that Israelis, particularly Benjamin Netanyahu, have been begging for years to drag the U.S. into a war, direct war and conflict with Iran. So there's no appetite for that. When you look at some of the key nominations, I think Tulsi Gabbard, who is now nominated to be the Director of National Intelligence, is a remarkable, actually, nomination. And in fact, you can see how remarkable it is because the political establishment have come to attack her. In fact, those that are considered or they present themselves as the left, such as Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts, is actually calling Tulsi Gabbard a foreign agent an agent of Russia, of Vladimir Putin. These are the talking points that are discredited, being brought back. Tulsi Gabbard, for those who may not know, is actually a veteran and also one of the key anti-war voices in the United States. She was against the war in Syria, etc. So that's also a very important sort of element. And remember, the Director of National Intelligence is the boss of the entire intelligence community, including institutions like the CIA. And so this is also a way for Trump to try to get a handle over the intelligence agencies, which in his first administration were very much trying to blow his administration up, right? So that's one way you can look at that. When you look at Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, he is a Russophobe. He's kind of like a Bushy from the old Bush administration. So he's a war hawk in a sense as well, particularly when it comes to Latin America, Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, perhaps even Colombia with its current president. There's an advocacy for regime change wars. So Marco Rubio is more of a war hawk, wants regime change, but then you have Tulsi Gabbard, who is an anti-regime change figure within U.S. politics as well. So I think there's quite a bit to see in terms of the Trump administration. I mean, last, if I can just point out, like I mentioned earlier, it's filled with climate change deniers. And from the perspective of the environment, you have Chris Wright, who is a fracking CEO, who's made the energy secretary. And he was pushed in that direction, supported particularly by the oil and gas lobby group. So essentially, you have regulatory capture of the Department of Energy by the oil and gas industry. You have Lee Zeldin, who is now in charge of the Environmental Protection Agency. Again, Lee Zeldin as well is an oil and gas candidate. So what you should expect then is a no commitment or a backward commitment when it comes to cooperation on climate change for the world. And in terms of the United States, there's going to be severe rollback of environmental protections inside the United States as well. So it's going to be a very, very bumpy ride, but one has to kind of wait and see how this is going to play itself out, who ends up actually staying. Because one of the things to kind of consider is that there's a permanent state in Washington, unelected, and so they craft policy. And the way that a US president can actually make an impact is to make sure that he or she is going to handle them. So Trump's strategy here can be kind of surrounding himself with sort of key establishment figures that are war hawks when it comes to, let's say, the Middle East, etc., or in Venezuela. But nevertheless, after kind of consolidating himself, 6 months, 8 months, can get rid of them. So we have to wait and see how this is going to play itself out. And I won't leave you without just mentioning the impact in terms of the United States. It's very disconcerting because one of the things is the focus on immigration and the fact that you have migrants, undocumented persons that are working 11 to 20 million, let's say, that figure. And so the idea of actually deporting this population is going to have a devastating impact on the United States. These are very fundamental to the U.S. economy, in agriculture, in services, in the restaurant industry, right? They pay billions of dollars in taxes. They also pay into the social safety net, which they can't even get, by the way, because they're undocumented. So it's actually going to hit the average American very, very hard. Right, so that's one aspect to kind of look at that. The other aspect is to always remember that where do these people come from? From Mexico, from Venezuela. Why? Because it's part of the deindustrialization process. So NAFTA, for instance, of offshoring factories to Mexico, created and destroyed the Mexican economy, which led to over 2 million people fleeing Mexico up north. As an example, a sanctions regime, brutal sanctions regime on Venezuela has resulted in one of the largest mass migrations, some of which end up in the United States again. So that link is not even made for the US public to consider. Lastly, I want you to think about, kind of the economic situation in sort of this country, which is that bringing jobs back. it's going to be very, very difficult to actually bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States, even if one puts as many tariffs as one wants. And this competition particularly is going to be with China, whether it's in electric vehicles, whether it's in really sector after sector. And one of the key problems is that the US labor is too expensive. And secondly, that US labor is not sufficiently educated, both in terms of literacy and in terms of numeracy. And this has to do with the policies of both parties of defunding education over 20, 30-year period, right? So even if one wanted to bring manufacturing back to the United States, it, in all honesty, is not an easy route, and it's not going to happen actually. So again, this is just a preliminary assessment as much as possible to look at what the Trump administration means going forward for the United States, and also going forward with some of its policy in terms of the rest of the world. And I just leave you with this: the world during the Trump 2 administration is very different than the world during the Trump 1 administration. The world during the Trump 2 administration is one that has incredible levels of connectivity, incredible levels of agency, whether you look at Iran, whether you look at China, whether you look at Russia. And so one of the ways to think about the changes that are coming in the next 4 to 5 years is to also look at other places and other centers, such as BRICS, as a forum of really creating new types of economic sort of globalization, if you will, right? That is bringing various regions together, et cetera. So it's very important to understand from that two sort of perspectives what the Trump administration is going to have in terms of its possible impact, even desired impact, but how the world has changed so much that even the room for maneuvers is much, much more limited. And the power of the US also in terms of the state apparatus to be able to achieve its objectives is in a context where it no longer has kind of this, this dominance.
Well, we haven't got more time, but just a very quick question. With all this information, with all this insecurity, the people, the world, especially the people who live in America, should they be scared or excited about Trump's government?
I don't think, fear paralyzes. So don't ever be scared, but rather be informed, be engaged, speak to other people, whether they're like-minded or not. Don't be pigeonholed to only speak people that have your perspectives. And that's one of the problems for the shock within, let's say, the mainstream establishment. They all thought they were going to win and hoodwink the American electorate because they have a $1 billion campaign with Beyonce singing and Taylor Swift. No. So I think it's important to have a healthy dialogue, but it's also very important, I think, in terms of the United States, and this goes very well for Europe. Democracy is not about elections. Democracy is actually about people's power and changing and using governments to enforce popular sort of policies that are benefiting the population. That requires engagement and activity after elections. Those are the important aspects. And so I think, this is what we can kind of expect, particularly with increasing pain and maybe the most outrageous, if possible, if there are going to be outrageous policies, such as snatch and grab operations of people off the streets of the United States for deportation of 1 million or so. That's going to actually be extremely destabilizing, and I don't think people will simply take it laying down. So again, activism and informed activism is really what defines being a politically engaged sort of individual, and not simply voting for two incredibly mediocre candidates and then going away for 4 years.
Wonderful. That's a great point to end our discussion with. Thank you so much again, Assistant Professor Beniam Awash. You came here last time and gave us broad discussion and analysis about the Horn of Africa and the US policy. And you came again. Hopefully you'll come back again. Thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure is mine. Thank you.
You've been watching Menalesh Meti in English. Our discussion with Assistant Professor Beniam has came to an end. Hopefully we'll see him again. I am Metasebia Ketsela. We'll see you again.